The message this week is entitled, An Unexpected Actor. An Unexpected Actor. You know, we have all heard the saying, and it's true, that God works in mysterious ways, right? And we don't always understand the ways in which he works, and we don't always even understand how he works through different types of people. And that's the example that we're going to see here in the scripture today. You know, it reminds me of a story of a pastor who was I think it was probably in the Gulf states. At least the story goes this way. And a hurricane comes through the town, and of course, torrential rainfall. We kind of know just a little taste of that from the last day or so. Torrential rainfall with the hurricane, and so the pastor, he's there at the church. It's right in the middle of the floodplain. He kneels down in the front of the church to be able to pray that God would spare the church from the flooding, and the waters begin to rise, and it's not too long until the emergency vehicles come by and they tell him, hey, you've got to evacuate. This is no good. You've got to get out of here. Come on, get in the truck. We'll take you right now, take you to safety. And he looks at them and he says, no, he says, God will protect me. I've been praying he's going to save this church and keep it from all the floodwaters that are coming. And he says, I'm going to stay. And then we see the floodwaters continue to rise in the streets, and they get so bad, in fact, that it's right up to the edge of the church, and the streets themselves you can navigate with a boat. Then a man comes by in a motorboat, and he comes to the pastor, and he says, you need to come right now because the waters are rising, and get in this boat, and we'll help you out of here. And he says, no. He says, I've prayed. God's going to see me through this. And he's going to protect this church and protect my life. And so, of course, the third scene is the levee breaks, and things get a lot worse. The waters get up so high, in fact, that the pastor has to get to the roof of the church in order to stay above the water line. And he's there on the roof of the church clinging to the steeple, and a helicopter comes by and says, Pastor, you need to come up. We need to get you out of here. And he says, no. He says, my God's going to protect me. And I know I'm going to be safe. Well, you know how the end of the story goes. It's not long till he's underwater, and the pastor is gone. And he stands then at the gates of heaven, and he begins to ask God. He says, God, I was praying for all, that you would save this church, you'd save my life, and you did all these things for me. He says, and, you never came. He says, you never saved me. Why did you not save me and save the church? And God says, well, I did. 3 times. I sent you an emergency vehicle, I sent you a boat, and I sent you a helicopter. And you sent them all away. So, that's, whether it's a true story, probably not. But nonetheless, it exercises a point, and that is this, that God sometimes works through circumstances and people that we don't always recognize and we don't always understand. And when you look at the passage this morning, we see that is happening in the life of Paul. The life of Paul is, if you remember, just to recap where we were at, Paul had gotten back from his missionary journeys. He had gotten back to Jerusalem. He had brought some of his Gentile converts with him. And he was in the midst of purifying himself to be able to speak to the congregation there, the church at Jerusalem. And he went to the temple as part of this process. And in the course of this, he was accused, falsely by the way, of allowing a Gentile to come into the courts of the temple complex. There was a place that the Gentiles could not pass, that barrier, and this is what he was accused of. It didn't actually happen, but nonetheless, this was part of the reason for the riot. You remember the Roman guards come, and they take him out of this riotous scene. He stands at the doorway, if you will, of the barracks where the guards were stationed, and he preaches a message of salvation to the crowd that was angry with him. And of course, that didn't convince them, and this is where we pick it up today. This is at the end of his speech to them. We pick up here actually in verse 21 of chapter 22. He gets to the end of his speech to them, and he says, as his parting words, he said unto me, speaking of God, he says, depart, for I will send thee far hence unto the Gentiles. And it says in verse 22, they gave him audience unto this word, and then lifted up their voices and said, Away with such a fellow from the earth, for it is not fit that he should live. We see in the course of this particular passage, starting here, and as we look at these next few verses ahead, that there's a continuing theme. Paul escapes with his life, barely, on 3 occasions. And he does it in every case due to the actions of an unregenerate and likely unsaved captain of the guard, a captain of the Roman guard. We're going to take a look at this unexpected actor today. And first of all, this captain that we see who is against the crowd. The captain against the crowd. This is where Paul begins. He ends his speech. He's there surrounded by the guards. The captain of the guard is about to take him a prisoner into the barracks. And he does let Paul, preach unto these people just before he brings them inside. And Paul gets to the end. He may not even have been to the end, but he says to them, this is how God has commissioned me. God saved me, and he told me to go and depart to the Gentiles to let them know of God's salvation. And it says, unto this word, they gave him audience unto this word. They listened to him until he got to this word. What's the word? Gentiles. They didn't like Gentiles. In fact, if you remember the story, this was the reason Paul got himself into trouble with the crowd in the first place, because they believed Paul had allowed a Gentile to go into the temple. And so when he gets to the place where he says, God told me to send salvation to the Gentiles, this was enough to throw them over the edge. They did not want to hear that God would somehow extend mercy and grace to Gentiles. They believed this was for the Jews only. And when they heard Paul claim that God would go and tell the Gentiles about salvation, this enraged them. It says, they gave him audience unto this word, then they lifted up their voices and said, Away with such a fellow from the earth. It is not fit that he should live. He's not fit to live. He's not fit to say another word to anyone. And so they begin to work things up in verse 23. They cried out. They cast off their clothes. They threw dust in the air. They began to riot. This is what the scene was looking like. When people cast off their clothes in this day and age, it was a sign that they were preparing themselves for a stoning. You may remember, in fact, when Paul was there at the stoning of Stephen, what was his job? It was to hold the clothes of the people. This was like the outer garments. They didn't, strip down to nothing, but they had the outer garments that they would put aside so that in the course of the dirty work of throwing stones to kill someone, they didn't get all of their clothes wrecked. Take the suit coat off first. That's the idea. And so this was Paul's job, in fact, when Stephen was stoned. He stood by and held their garments. This is what they were preparing to do to Paul now. They were taking off their garments so that they were preparing to do that. They were throwing dirt up in the air. This was a riot that was just on the verge of really taking Paul's life. And even though Paul was surrounded by Roman guards in this scene, the crowd doesn't seem to care. It doesn't seem to deter them in the least. They are still about to do what they want to do, whether there's consequences for it or not. And so it says, they threw dust in the air. The chief captain commanded him to be brought into the castle and bade that he should be examined by scourging, that he might know whereof they cried so against him. And so the chief captain intervenes at this critical moment. Paul was literally minutes away from being dragged into the streets and dying just like Stephen the martyr did at this point. But instead, the chief captain sees what's going on, recognizing that the people aren't going to be deterred by his own guard, and he tells them, hey, we need to get him inside. And he takes them into their own barracks, and this is what he wants to do. The question is, why would the chief captain care to deal with Paul in this way? Well, it was the chief captain's job to do these kind of things. He was acting out of duty. We need to remember that why were the Romans there in the first place? Why were they there in Jerusalem? Well, of course, they were the overseers. They were the conquerors of this nation, as they were of many other nations at this time. They were there to keep the peace. They had just gone through a very difficult time in Jerusalem where the Jews had a history of uprising and riots and trying to take over and taking back the temple and trying to resist Roman rule. And so they were there to keep the peace. And anytime that there was a big group of people together, they were there to make sure nothing out of the ordinary happened. And so this man, this chief captain, wanted to make sure things didn't get out of hand. He was acting out of duty. He was not going to allow this group of people to riot or overthrow the rule of Rome. There's no indication here that he could care one iota about Paul. Paul was just the pawn in the midst of this whole scene for him. For him, the main thing was, I don't want a crowd of people getting out of hand and taking some of this land back that we're here to protect. But in the course of all of this, what did the captain do? He saved Paul's life. This Roman guard, acting out of duty, saved Paul's life. Not because he had mercy on Paul, not because he thought it was unfair about what the crowd was doing, not because he pitied Paul, because we know what he was about to do. In fact, he could care less about Paul. He says he took him inside, and he says he bade that he should be examined by scourging. He says, let's bring him inside and beat him ourselves. This is what he's basically saying. Let's not let the crowd do it. We'll take him inside and do it right. This is what he's doing with Paul. He saved him just so that he could scourge him. Why did the Romans do this? Well, this was a very common tactic or technique. Today we would call it torture. You would call it torture in order to extract a confession, right? There's all sorts of methods that, you think about some of the modern warfare and modern ways to torture people. Well, they knew all about it back in the Roman days as well. They knew that if they tortured someone enough, scourged him, that they could use that to get Paul to confess, and then he could be properly tried and properly convicted through legal courses because he's now confessed to whatever it is that he's done. And so here we see the captain against a crowd. This is a guy who had no business in Paul at all, didn't really understand or care what Paul was up to, but yet God used an unregenerate Roman captain who was acting out of duty to save one of his servants for a particular purpose. And this is kind of our first point this morning. Sometimes God uses people in our lives. People who don't know the Lord, don't even care about the Lord, but they act out of a sense of duty. And they do that, and ultimately they do what God wants to accomplish in our lives. God doesn't always use believers with a kind heart and the right motivation to accomplish his purposes. Sometimes he takes the crooked arrow and he uses it to point to wherever he needs it to go. And this is what he was doing with the captain when the captain came out against the crowd. Let's look at the second thing, the second instance that we see here with the captain. We see captain was accused of cruelty. Verse 24 and 25, we see now the scene. He's brought inside. The chief captain commanded him to be brought into the castle. He bade that he should be examined by scourging, that he might know wherefore they had cried so against him. And as they bound him with thongs, Paul said unto the centurion that stood by, Hey, is it lawful for you to scourge a man that is a Roman and uncondemned? As if Paul didn't know the answer to this. Oh, by the way, just out of curiosity, is this legal? Is this something you guys should really be doing? They were literally about to torture him to get a confession out of him. He was literally in the process of being strapped to what's essentially a whipping post. And as he's in the course of doing this, he turns to the centurion who's in charge of this whole procedure, and he says to him, Hey, can you do this to a Roman citizen? Is that okay? I just want to check, to be sure. I don't have my lawyer here to look up the books. And that's what he says to him. And then, of course, knowing the answer, verse 26, when the centurion heard that, he put a halt. He said, Whoa, hold your horses here a second. Just wait a second. We're going to go check with the chief captain here. He says he tells the chief captain saying, Take heed what thou doest, for this man is a Roman. And then the chief captain came and said, tell me, art thou a Roman? He was not believing this. He wasn't sure about this. How could this be? This doesn't normally occur. Now, in our day and age, we don't really understand the idea of citizenship, but Roman citizenship was a big thing back then. For us, anybody that's born on American soil, right, becomes a U.S. citizen, and lots of other people do too somehow. But we won't go there today. But nonetheless, citizenship is something that is just natural for us. In the Roman world, Roman citizenship was a high prize to be held. It was something of great value. The Romans were a conquering force, right? They were a conquering empire. They went from country to country, from region to region, and they would overtake and oppress and sometimes enslave the people that they conquered. Judah, Jerusalem, all of these places, these were no exception. They would often set up Jewish governors under their authority, but to be a Roman citizen, no, none of them got that citizenship. They were just under the rule of Rome. They weren't citizens of Rome. Citizens of Rome got a special status, a special priority. And most people were not Roman citizens. Rome had ruled and conquered these people, and the Roman citizens had special rights and privileges that the average person did not have. And so the chief captain says, tell me, are you really a Roman? And he said, yea. And the chief answered, said, with a great sum I obtained this freedom. You see, the chief captain, he wasn't even born into Rome. He says, I had to really work hard and pay a big high price in order to obtain this citizenship. I bought my way in, he said. And Paul said, but I was freeborn. Not only did Paul say, I didn't do this because I had a lot of money or I had friends in high places or because I had, a strategic way to become a Roman citizen. He says, I'm naturally a Roman citizen. You say, how did Paul, a Jew, a Pharisee of Pharisees, get this Roman citizenship? Maybe sometimes you've asked that question. Well, of course, we know Paul was born in Tarsus, right? Paul of Tarsus is sometimes known as. And Tarsus was known as a Roman colony. Tarsus was originally established as a city on the Mediterranean Sea, and it was originally established as a retirement community for the Roman military. So it was like, South Florida, right? It was like the retirement village for the Romans. This is what Tarsus was like. And it was known as a free colony. All that were born in the city of Tarsus were immediately granted Roman citizenship. It was part of the credentials and the rights that they got from just being there and born in Tarsus. And so in opposition to what the captain had to do, Paul just had to be born. He came from Tarsus. Now we know that he grew up and he was taught in Jerusalem, but his citizenship came because of where he was born, where he was from. And when he found out that Paul was from Tarsus, that he was a freeborn citizen from that place, what does it say? He says, they straightway they departed from him which should have examined him, and the chief captain also was afraid after he knew that he was a Roman, because he had bound him. So the chief captain here, he changes his tune real quick. We're going to take him right down from that whipping post. Paul, you need a glass of water? You feeling all right? Have a seat here, Paul. Let's have a talk. Things aren't, you just forget about that stuff that just happened a moment ago, right? You're not going to hold that against me, right, Paul? This is where the chief captain was. All of a sudden, he realized what he had done, that he was not allowed to do. You can't do this to a Roman citizen, certainly without a fair trial. He could have easily lost his job. He could have lost his life. He could have lost his Roman citizenship for treating another Roman this way. And so this struck some fear into him. And that kind of brings us to this next point about how people sometimes work in our lives. Sometimes people act out of duty and God accomplishes something through them. And sometimes people act out of fear. And even though they're acting out of fear, God can still use it to accomplish and fulfill his plan. And, Paul used his citizenship as leverage here. We recognize that. And I think there's an important lesson for us there as well. God gives every one of us resources. He gives us Maybe you have some special status, some special pull with somebody. You have a citizenship, or you have a card for this or something or another. Some type of membership somewhere that gives you the ability to do something maybe someone else can't. Maybe he's given you that for a purpose and for a season. And maybe it's something that he expects you to use for his glory. And we need to be recognizing that. Our resources we have, Paul's citizenship, he uses it different times in the course of his ministry. Who would have thought that Paul would have ever needed to be a Roman citizen? But here was Paul traveling all of the known Roman world. Paul growing up, think about this. Paul was born a Roman citizen, probably meant nothing to him. Went to Jerusalem, grew up under the feet of Gamaliel, had been taught, had become a Pharisee of the Pharisees, had decided, I'm going to persecute these Christians, I'm going to chase them out of Jerusalem. Remember, he dedicated his life to this, he was zealous in every way, and the next thing you know, God gets a hold of him. Changes his life, he becomes a believer, and the next thing we know, Paul is commissioned to go to the Gentile world. He's commissioned to go to all of these cities full of Gentiles all throughout Rome, a place that non-citizens wouldn't have the same ability to travel as he would. He would have, just because of his citizenship, special rights, special privileges in every one of these cities, something that Peter the Jewish fisherman wouldn't have, something that John and James and all the other disciples that followed Jesus all those years, they went to these places as well, but none of them were Roman citizens. They didn't have that right and privilege. It wasn't until many years later that Paul recognized the value of the Roman citizenship that he had been born into. And there may be resources lying dormant in our lives that God may still want to use. We have to be looking for and recognizing those opportunities because he gives us resources for a purpose and for a plan that he has for us. And sometimes God does use, just like this chief captain, somebody in our life who doesn't, again, there's no sense that the chief captain cares about Paul. The chief captain cares about himself. He's worried about himself. He's doing these things out of fear. But ultimately, once again, he's saving Paul's life. He's fulfilling God's plan for Paul through an unregenerate captain of the guard. Well, let's look at the third point this morning. We go down to verse 30, and we see, thirdly, that the captain here is now afraid of the council and their efforts. Verse 30, it says, on the morrow, the next day, because he would have known the certainty where he was accused of the Jews, he loosed him from his bands and commanded the chief priests and all their council to appear and brought Paul down and set him before them. So now Paul was taken out of handcuffs, brought down as a Roman citizen, and said, you're going to stand before the Sanhedrin here. This was the commission, the council of Jewish leaders at the time, who were going to present their charges before Paul, the Roman citizen. And they were going to determine whether this was something that the Romans were going to care about or not. He was now being protected by the captain, not persecuted by him, right? He was brought down in a special status. That he had arranged to have this council come before him to get to the bottom of the accusations against Paul, and he had asked the Sanhedrin to convene to allow them to make this happen. And so, interestingly enough, we turn to chapter 23, and Paul, of course, taking the opportunity, he realizes what he has in front of him, and he says, he earnestly, beholding the council, in verse 1, said, men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. They didn't even get to hear as far as the crowd did, and Ananias turns to him and said, somebody smite that man in the face. Somebody take care of Paul and tell him to shut his mouth. That's essentially what he's doing. And he says, he turns to him that stood by and then said, Paul unto him, God shall smite thee, thou whited wall, for thou sittest to judge me after the law, and commandest to me to be smitten contrary to the law. And so Paul basically turns back to Ananias, not apparently realizing who he was at the time, and said, hey, somebody needs to smite you in the mouth and shut you up. This is essentially what Paul's saying. He says, you're not going to do that to me. You have no right. The law doesn't let you do these things. And so this is where he goes. And so they that stood by said, revilest thou God's high priest? Then said Paul, I wist not, brethren, that he was the high priest, for it is written, thou shalt not speak evil of the ruler of thy people. Paul, first of all, he wants to express before the council, number one, I'm innocent. This is what he declares. He says, I'm innocent. I'm not only innocent before you all, I'm innocent before God. I have a clear conscience before him. And he wanted to make sure that was declared. And when it's interesting, he calls this Ananias, who was the high priest, a whited wall. Isn't this an interesting reference that Paul uses? Who else do we know that has used this reference before the Pharisees? Jesus himself. It very well harkens back to what Jesus had said to them. Matthew 23:27, Jesus said, Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye are like whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead men's bones and of all uncleanness. See, Paul looked at him and he said, you guys, you are all shined up on the outside. You all think you have it together, but I know on the inside you don't know the Lord. On the inside, you're dead as a doornail. You've got no love for the Lord at all, and you certainly have rejected his Christ. I'm sure that just cut to the heart at exactly what the problem was that Paul was facing. And in fact, the reason Paul was there was not just because of the Gentiles. It's because they realized who he was. They realized he was a turncoat from their own ranks, and they realized that they were going to do all they could to silence him. But Paul, at the same time, was not apparently aware that Ananias was the high priest. And he didn't want to be disrespectful, and he apologizes. I think this is an interesting back and forth exchange that maybe is something we all need to understand. That sometimes we need to have a balance. Sometimes it's right to call a spade, so to speak. Sometimes it's okay to call things the way it is, to rebuke someone in a public forum, but there's also a time and a place to do it in a respectful manner. You don't have to be rude in order to offer a rebuke. And Paul says, I'm sorry, that was rude. I didn't realize you were the high priest. That's not proper for me to do that. It's disrespectful to me to say it that way. And so he takes back what he said. It was the truth. They deserved this rebuke. But this wasn't the time or the place. That takes a lot of wisdom for us, doesn't it? Sometimes we get the blood boiling and we want to just come out of the cage swinging, right? And we have to be careful because sometimes we need to be swinging harder than we are. And sometimes maybe we need to be back off and be a little more respectful than what we are. Again, it takes God's wisdom. And this is what Paul recognizes here in this exchange. And then we see in verse 6, Paul then recognizes what he's up against. He looks around the room. He probably even knew a lot of these guys that were there, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, because he had been a part of them for many years. Paul perceived that the one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees. And so he says, well, I'm thinking about a legal strategy here. And my legal strategy is known as chaos. I'm going to inject some chaos into the situation. And he looks at them and he says, I want you all to know another thing about me. Not only am I innocent, but I'm a Pharisee. In fact, my dad was a Pharisee. And it's because of what we believe as Pharisees that I'm called into question. The hope and the resurrection of the dead. He says, when he had so said, there arose a dissension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the multitude was divided. Now, again, we got to know a little bit of background here. I think we've gone over it before. The easiest way to remember is this truth. The Sadducees and Pharisees were both Jewish rulers, and they both had a different view as to what the Jewish scriptures, the Old Testament, would have said about certain things. The Pharisees believed there would be a resurrection, and the Sadducees did not. They did not believe in a resurrection. And, of course, this became one of the main, dividing lines between their beliefs, and it was a sore subject between them. When they began talking and fighting about it, it became a real problem. And so they began to argue and debate, and Paul basically throws this bomb right in the middle of them and says, hey, I want you to know that I'm a Pharisee. I believe in the hope and the resurrection of the dead. That's why I'm here, and you people can't even agree on it. And so all of a sudden, there's an uproar. The Sadducees, there arose a great cry, it says. The scribes that were of the Pharisees' part arose and strove, saying, well, we find no evil in this man. He's one of us. This is what they're saying. Oh, he's a good guy. He believes in what we believe. We're not going to argue with him. And of course, the Sadducees, they felt the other way. And he says, if a spirit or angel has spoken to him, let us not fight against God. They were almost willing to accept even that Paul was spoken to by Jesus himself because of what side he placed himself on. And when there arose a great dissension, the chief captain, fearing lest Paul should have been pulled in pieces of them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him by force from among them and bring him to the castle. So again, this is a strategic move by Paul. He recognized these two groups. He knew that their differences were strong, and he capitalized on that in order to introduce controversy to the proceedings. Now, here's the question. Was Paul being disingenuous in what he was saying at this point in time? You say, why was Paul being brought here? Well, we know he was brought here because he was being accused of bringing a Gentile into the temple. And he tells them in the middle of the council, I'm here because I believe in the hope and the resurrection of the dead. Well, you could say, well, maybe that's not really might be a white lie from Paul, right? Maybe he wasn't telling the truth. And I say no. I think the answer is Paul just presents the accusation in a different way. Because really, what is at the base, at the heart of why he was being brought to the council that day? It was because he believed in Christ. And what is it that he believed about Christ? That through Christ there was hope. Through Christ there was resurrection. Through Christ was the only means people had for hope in eternity. And he says, this hope meshes with the hope that I even had as a Pharisee. We recognized as Pharisees that one day there would be a Messiah that would come and that would ultimately give us hope and bring us resurrection from the dead. He says, we as Pharisees recognize that. Now, you haven't seen Christ to be that Messiah yet, but that's why I'm called into question here today, because I've seen Christ, and I've seen that hope and resurrection of the dead realized in him, and my hope for the future is because of him. Ultimately, this is where Paul was before the people. He wasn't being disingenuous because the truth is that's the heart of why he was brought there that day. And so we have to be careful. You say, boy, Paul was being a little bit shady. He was just, trying to get out of a trouble. No, I think in a way he was presenting the gospel right before his own people, right before the Pharisees. He says, I know all about the hope and the resurrection. I know it more than I ever did because I know it through Christ. And it wasn't the right time to really get into the legalities of things. And so ultimately, in the course of the dissension, he got pulled out. Interestingly enough, who pulls him out one more time? The chief captain. The chief captain, 3 times in the course of just a couple of days, saves Paul's life. You say, that seems really coincidental. Well, I don't think it is. I think it's put here in the book of Acts so that we recognize sometimes God uses people who we don't know, who don't even like us, who maybe don't even care about us to accomplish his plan. Now, Paul does use his insight and wisdom. Paul uses his resourcefulness, and I think God wants us to be resourceful in our dealings with others. We can't just be, ignorant and, well, do what you want with me, and it's okay. Even Jesus told us in Matthew 10:16, he says, behold, I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves. Be ye therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves. I think this is what Paul was doing here. He was trying to be as wise as a serpent without causing a fight himself. But I think here we see the chief captain, he's acting out of a sense of honor. And sometimes God uses people who act out of a sense of honor to give ultimate honor to him. And I just want to say, kind of in conclusion, when we think about these 3 instances of this chief captain, I want to just say that, in none of these cases do we see that whether he was acting out of duty or fear or honor or whatever it was, the text never indicates that this captain became a believer. He might have, we just don't know. We're going to find out later in the course of the next section here in Acts that we find out who the name of this chief captain is. And interestingly enough, God even uses him to write some of the scripture that we find. That's an interesting point. Here was an unregenerate, Roman chief captain, his very words get penned into Scripture. You're going to see that a little bit later here in the book of Acts. But we don't know what the motivation was, why the captain always saved Paul's life. We just know that God used him. And I think this is an important point. We don't always know, we can't always trust the motivation of other people. But we can trust that God can use anyone, even people that aren't on our team, even people that are against us, to accomplish his greater purpose and plan through them. And what does this do to us? What should this do to us as believers? What's our takeaway? Well, the takeaway is this. Our God's sovereign. Our God is bigger than our circumstances. Our God is bigger than the people that are against us. Our God is bigger than the councils that convene. Our God is bigger than the crowds that riot. Our God is bigger than even the Roman Empire that thought they had it all under control. Our God's bigger than all those things. And it's not just that he's bigger. He's already figured out a way, a plan for each one of us, through every one of us. As we follow him, as we seek his face, as we seek to go after what he's called us to do, just like Paul did, you know what? Yeah, he wants us to use our resources, and he wants us to be, wise as serpents, harmless as doves, and have wisdom sometimes as to know whether to be, when to rebuke someone and when not. But in the end, God has his plan for you. And that should give you some confidence. That should give you some hope, because you're not on your own. As you follow him, he's going to take care of you. He takes care of his own, and sometimes he does it in some of the most mysterious of ways.